Thank you, Lascan Corda. Last week, the Taoiseach told the Dáil that government is committed to recognising the sacrifices that public sector workers, in particular frontline healthcare workers, have made. 12 months ago, I raised the need to properly recognise the Trojan work of frontline healthcare workers with the Taoiseach. In particular, all those across our hospital and community health services, from cleaners to consultants. I raised it again with him 4 months ago, and I have no doubt that the government is committed to providing recognition to staff. But it seems to me, from reading between the lines, that the need to recognise frontline healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants, cleaners, porters and others who place themselves at risk by going to work every day to keep us safe and to care for those who are seriously ill, is now caught up in some relativity battle across the public service. I remind you again of what the Taoiseach said last week. The government is committed to recognising the sacrifices that public sector workers have made. That, I believe, is the reason why the HSE, when it sat down with the health unions last week, stated that it had no mandate from government to negotiate any bonus payment. Staff at the front line within our health service have been put in a unique position during this pandemic. Yes, right across the public service, staff have worked in challenging circumstances, but no group of public sector workers put their lives and those of their families at risk to a greater extent than our healthcare workers. And many of them put their hand into their own pockets to do so, paying for alternative accommodation so they wouldn't infect a vulnerable person in their own home, paying for additional childcare if it was available so that they cover for sick colleagues, and I could go on. And many of these staff are physically and mentally exhausted, facing into the fourth wave of this virus, dealing with the huge impact of the cyber attack, covering staffing shortages due to COVID infection and long COVID, and now facing a backlog in waiting times for appointments and for procedures. These staff need time off. They need time to recover before they break down completely. And Tánaiste, you will be very well aware that exhausted healthcare staff are a recipe for mistakes, with the potentially fatal consequences for patients and huge financial consequences for the state. We must now, today, recognise that time off is imperative for their health. And secondly, we must give proper recognition to staff at the front line, like, for example, the Scottish Government have done by paying every NHS worker a bonus of £500.
Thanks very much, Deputy. I think we'll all agree that our healthcare workers have done an amazing job throughout the pandemic so far. We can be very proud of our public health service. It's much maligned, it has its imperfections, but I think the pandemic has proved to us that it's much better than many people believed it was, and it really stood up and scaled up in the way we asked it to during the pandemic. While all public servants, including healthcare workers, have received modest pay increases over the course of the pandemic, I don't think they're adequate to recognise the value of the work that was carried out during the pandemic, and I know you'll agree with that too. So the government does want to recognise the work that was done in a special way. It could be done through a financial bonus, it could be done through additional leave paid, taken over a number of years, but there are some real complications and real factors that we need to take into account. First of all, the pandemic isn't over yet. I guarantee you it's not over yet, and that will become apparent to people, I think, over the next couple of weeks. It isn't just healthcare workers who have put their shoulders to the wheel when it comes to the pandemic. Lots of other public servants have too, in Department of Social Protection, in Revenue, in my own department, making sure that businesses got the grants that they needed. In the private sector, in areas like retail and transport, GPs, for example, and also the many volunteers who I've met during my shifts in the vaccine centres, and they need to be recognised too. I think it would be a mistake not to look at this in the round, and that's what we need to do. And then even among healthcare workers, there has been very significant variation. Some people having to do twice the work they would normally have done, others being redeployed, some actually having reduced workloads because their service was shut down or suspended through no fault of their own. So this is not straightforward, and it's something that we are going to have to work out. It's something we're going to have to negotiate. is something that's going to have to be fair, and is something that's going to have to be funded. As Concorda, as this might be my last occasion to talk about COVID in this chamber before the recess, there are just a few things I would like to say. First of all, the pandemic is not over. We're entering a new phase of the pandemic. We have vaccines now, which has weakened the connection between cases and hospitalisations and deaths, but has not broken it. And we have a virus now that is more infectious than ever before. At the start of the pandemic, older people were the most vulnerable. We asked them to stay at home, and that saved lives and prevented a lot of illness. But things have changed. Now, unvaccinated people, that is, people who are not fully vaccinated, are the most vulnerable. And over the course of the next few weeks, people who are not fully vaccinated are at greater risk than ever before in this pandemic, because this virus is so transmissible. We've had 200 people in ICU in the past 2 months. 199 of them were not fully vaccinated. We're seeing a major surge in cases, almost entirely among younger people and people who are not fully vaccinated. And we as a government and we as a parliament have a responsibility now to protect those who are not fully vaccinated. And I asked them over the summer that at least until you're fully vaccinated, please avoid socialising indoors. Please keep your social contacts to a minimum. Please avoid non-essential foreign travel, and please wear a mask even outdoors in crowded scenarios. People who are unvaccinated are more at risk over the next few weeks than at any point in this pandemic. It is not over.
Denis Naughten.
Honest, 52 weeks ago, I said here in Dáil Éireann to the Taoiseach that if it wasn't possible to reward healthcare workers with pay increases or some form of a bonus system, the minimum that we should offer them is additional paid leave. It would be time to spend with their families, with whom they have sacrificed precious family time. It will be time to recover from the physical and emotional tiredness that they are undoubtedly feeling. And the Taoiseach was generous in his response, stating that the government will examine the Deputy's suggestion and proposal. In the spirit of the Taoiseach's response last July, I sincerely ask you not to postpone the much-needed recognition until the end of the pandemic, not to incorporate it into some broader public service pay battle, but instead to move on the need for recognition of healthcare workers now.
Thanks, Deputy. I agree with your sentiments. I certainly discussed them with the Minister for Public Expenditure and the Minister for Health, but I would restate what I said earlier. This pandemic is not over. We're heading into a difficult couple of weeks where we will see cases soar and hospitalisations and ICU admissions rise and deaths rise again, sadly. People who are unvaccinated are more at risk in the next few weeks than at any point since this pandemic began. And we need to get that message across to people. Our hospitals and our health service is going to be busy again. I think we can avoid, and we certainly want to avoid, any reintroduction of restrictions. Things are different now because of the vaccine, but there is still a huge number of people who are not fully vaccinated. Cases are rising. They are at more risk than they ever were before since this pandemic began because of Delta. And there is a risk that if they don't take care, that they will overwhelm our hospitals and put those healthcare workers under enormous strain again. And the final message I'd have from this House before we rise for the recess, just to please say to unvaccinated people, you're at very high risk. Treat this pandemic as seriously as you did at any point since it began.
Thank you.